So welcome to another edition of the Secure Dynamics TechCast. With me, I have Eric Pearce. Eric, your official title is the IT Systems Architect at Nutanix, correct?
Yes.
All right.
I've been there about. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for joining. And for the viewers, the way Eric and I connected is I actually interviewed Wendy Pfeiffer, who's the CIO at Nutanix. And this is typically what I usually do is do a social profile on my guest and kind of look at what he or she has commented on, talked about, spoken about, and so forth. And she had actually referenced to your article, Eric. And it became a really interesting dialogue. And then you reached out to me about another interesting article, which we'll kind of get to in a bit. So that's how you and I connected. So I'm going to put you on the spot and really start referring the reference to the article where you call this the NG network engineer. I've heard of NG firewall and NG everything else, right? I haven't heard of an NG network engineer. And I'm just going to read this out and then have your comments on that. For me, it was a wonderful read of self-reflection because you talked about not wanting to venture outside your comfort zone. And you mentioned SDN way before it became popular. And you were also talking about pivoting and giving advice to fellow geeks. So I'll pause over there. What was the motivation behind writing this kind of article? And I know this might sound biased, but a lot of times you have this idea in your head about tech geeks who are in front of a computer and want to get stuff done. This was much more broad-ranging that it touched upon the humanity aspect and the need for people to self-reflect and unlearn and relearn. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I found that it helps for me to have a specific person in mind when I'm essentially writing as I would speak to someone, kind of, giving him advice. I've been doing this for more than 20 years, and I was working with a colleague at work that's, relatively young, just starting out, but I saw he was kind of struggling with some of the, I don't know, like most of the networking gear now is based on Linux, right? Mm-hmm. And then he didn't have great Linux skills, so I was sort of encouraging him to learn more about that. And then, there's a huge automation trend, right? So how would somebody from a traditional networking background get into automation? So there's lots of tools there. That's, so it really works best for me if I have a specific personality that I know in mind. So I'm not writing it to, the original intent wasn't to write it for the whole world. It was, the one or two people I was trying to reach at work in a way, or maybe even past colleagues. So kind of nudging them a little bit, saying, based on my experience, please go out and broaden your experience, to be, I actually, one of the first LinkedIn articles I wrote was the rise of the generalists, kind of showing how a single person now could be doing, networking, virtualization, storage, where, not that long ago, and also at some big companies, those are all distinct departments, entire departments, right? So someone comes in with a request saying, I need this VM or something, and it has to ticket kind of makes its way through all the silos, right? And it pops out at the end. But today, like with a Nutanix product here, the same person's doing all those tasks in 20 minutes, right? So it was more just a reflection of what I see myself doing, and then seeing other colleagues perhaps being somewhat limited by their knowledge, and then kind of encouraging them. And here's the technique that worked for me. Because I found this through experiences. People are like, well, I need to learn this new thing, so I'll spend a weekend or a few hours after work, and I have totally failed at that. The only way I can retain and learn things is to make it part of my day job. So that was kind of the reason why I wanted to spread this.
Yes, I think I was going to hit you upon that exact point because that caught my attention too. And I have this quoted over here, which is, I'll study this at night or on the weekends, right? And talk a little bit about the inclusive culture, the need for management support, but also colleague support to be able to imbibe something new, because clearly there is antibodies at work, whether obvious or behind the back, who don't want to move beyond their comfort zone. And here is Eric coming in saying, okay, I'm going to make a change over here. So how do you go about winning minds, winning hearts, so that you can actually make that part of the ethos?
Well, I think the best motivation in some cases is for selfish reasons. I mean, I want to have peers that are interested in the same things that I'm doing, right? Yeah. So that's, part of this is like, I want to grow the number of peers I have, where I can say, hey, look at this cool thing I created. What do you think? Or they may do something and I'm like, oh, I didn't think of that. Can I steal your code, modify it and use it for my own purposes? So it's, And I think, I've been at like the one IT person at small companies, and so the problem is you have no peers, right? So what do? You write and try to get peers. So I've written or co-authored books and done magazine articles. So that was kind of a desperate cry for peers when I was, the only IT person at a small startup. And now that I have, a medium-sized company, I do have, potentially, 10 people or something in a group that might be interested in the same topic. I just think it's smart to look around every once in a while, no matter how comfortable you are in your job, and to see what's happening outside your business. You're not scared, basically, if something doesn't work out, right? You make sure you reconfirm that you're working on skills that are valued by the industry, not just your employer. I just think that's just smart.
Yeah, I mean, those are absolutely golden words, especially now, right? And you're looking at so many businesses getting upended and seeing, I mean, no one could have forecast the business turmoil that we're in right now. But that being said, like you said, going out and saying, hey, is this SDN thing even worth it? Yeah, you might be really good at I don't know, Cisco, Juniper, and other things. But if this open source thing really takes off, what are my skills? One last question for you, and I'm not going to get into this entire article because we're going to reserve another spot for it in future. But
Okay.
This was the latest article that you sent to me, which is running a successful discovery effort.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of things you had mentioned, but I'm going to stop at the first one, which I think is hugely, hugely important, which is how do you, if you take the first step, and how do you allow others to want to be part of it, but also kind of have skin in the game. And one of the things you had mentioned is don't map the whole thing out, leave some white spaces. So vague and obvious white spaces, which obviously, Eric, you can fill, but you purposely don't fill it. Allowing others, hey, by the way, Eric, did you miss this? Or what about this? And they feel that they've contributed and they're part of the, I thought that was stunning. So is that also something you learned along the way, or how did you kind of have to learn through the School of Hard Knocks?
I'd say more of the latter. I just working with some uncooperative groups, and it was just very hard to get them going, right? Because if you just essentially put up a blank whiteboard with a blank Zoom display, people don't engage. They don't know how to start. There's definitely something where they're afraid to speak up first. So I'm willing to speak up first to get what I want at the end. I'm actually an introvert. I mean, don't think I'm that. But so this is a way I found to sort of kind of bootstrap the process. I mean, I don't want to say I'm blatantly manipulating people, but there's a little bit of trickery there to kind of get that first going. And then the moment someone says, actually, that's wrong what you wrote, or, that's not how it works, I'm like, my interaction is great. I've got something going. And I would say when I was, further back in the past, I would have been very defensive to that reaction, right? I would have taken that personally. It's like, how dare you criticize my work? And now I'm just realizing the bigger win is getting the conversation started. And, I can put my ego aside, and and it takes a very good sign, right? That's usually the reason I'm doing it.
Yeah, it also speaks to your comfort in your own shoes, to being stood up there and being pointed out, hey, Eric, you made a mistake over there. And lots of times, you're right, it's like, hey, our ego or self-esteem is usually, hey, I can't be wrong, right? And so even that, and how does it work? I mean, as an engineer, again, I go back 20, 25 years as an engineer, and I've kind of strayed long from that path. But have engineers become more comfortable dealing with the gray versus the black and white?
I know
that's a broad question.
But I don't know. I mean, I guess in my early career you kind of lived and died by your technical competence, right? And it was a zero-sum game. You're always competing with everybody else outside the company, competing with people within the meeting room, and maybe it just, I don't know, more maturity or the role or something allows me to say, I don't have to be the smartest one in the room. I actually don't want to be the smartest one in the room. I want to get input from others, and maybe that just comes with experience. But I don't know too many people that feel that way when they're sort of starting out, right? Because their ego is kind of riding on everything, where they're, the stakes seem higher for that. But in the long run, that's not what's important.
Yeah, it's also interesting you mentioned that, because Eric, I mean, you mentioned the stakes seem important. I think, I mean, obviously, there are folks along different demographic, different age groups and categories, right? And you can always make the case, hey, the stakes are really important when you're starting a career, when you're, I don't know, mid-level manager, when you're a VP in a company. It's like, but I think what you brought out over here, which is it's okay to be wrong. And sometimes you're naturally wrong. Sometimes, like you said, it's a way of getting people to feel invested and say, hey, Eric, I corrected you. And he or she feels like, hey, they're contributing as well, right? So I think that's super.
Well, I mean, it's your reaction to it too. Do you get all defensive and been out of shape and shut down, or you say, "Great, thank you. What's the next contribution you make?"
Exactly.
I mean, I think that's the change, right? And I mean, personally, I try not to say things that I haven't tried myself.
Yeah.
I think that helps, right? I'm not. My reputation is everything of not just going off and babbling about a bunch of stuff that I actually haven't done, right? I mean, that's so my credibility comes from. I only can tell you with authority about things I actually tried myself, right? So that'd be another component of that, is having a reputation of not sticking your neck out and talking about something that you haven't even really experienced yourself.
Yeah. No, that's also very true. I think reputation does matter and credibility does matter. But at the same time, I think, like you said, having those white spaces in between and saying, hey, you're venturing out and you don't have all the answers. And maybe there are people out there.
And that's okay.
Yeah, it's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I had a business school professor of mine long back who told me, allow yourself the discomfort, right? And it was like, be generous with yourself, and that's the allow piece. And the discomfort piece is always push boundaries, right? And I'm sure there are many more things on that particular article that I want to kind of touch upon. We'll come back the next time. Again, Eric, thanks for your time.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.